While in Europe, Zhou studied the differing approaches to resolving class conflict adopted by the various European nations. In London in January 1921, he witnessed a miners' strike and wrote a series of articles for the Yishibao newspaper, examining the conflict between workers and employers, and the conflict's resolution. After 5 weeks in London he moved to Paris. In a letter to his cousin, Zhou identified 2 broad paths of reform for China: gradual reform, or violent means. Zhou wrote that, "I do not have a preference for either the Russian or the British way, I would prefer something in between, rather than one of these 2 extremes." Zhou participated in 2 military operations conducted by the nationalist regime in 1925, later known as the First and Second Eastern Expeditions. The first was in January 1925 when Chen Zhongming attempted to retake the city of Guangzhou. The nationalists' campaign against Chen consisted of forces from the Guangdong Army under Xu Chongji, and 2 training regiments of the Nationalist Party, Army, led by Chiang Kai-shek and staffed by Whampoa Academy officers and cadets. The fighting lasted until May 1925, with the defeat of Chen's forces. Zhou had accompanied the Whampoa cadets on the expedition as a political officer. Zhou originally planned to win one of the scholarships offered by the Chinese government. These scholarships required the Chinese students to pass entrance exams in Japanese universities. He took entrance exams for at least 2 schools, but didn't get accepted. His anxieties were compounded by the death of his uncle, Zhou Yaqui, his inability to master Japanese and the Japanese cultural chauvinism that discriminated against the Chinese students. By the time he returned to China in spring 1919, he had become disillusioned with Japanese culture and rejected the idea that the Japanese political model was relevant to China. When the People's Republic of China was founded on October 1, 1949, Zhou notified all governments that any countries wishing to have diplomatic relations with the People's Republic must end their relationship with Chiang Kai-shek's regime in Taiwan, and support the People's Republic's claim to China's seat in the United Nations. This was the first foreign policy document issued by the Communist government. By 1950, the People's Republic gained diplomatic relationships with other communist countries and with 13 non-communist countries, but talks with most Western governments weren't successful. In June 1923, the Third Congress of the Chinese Communist Party accepted the Comintern's instructions to ally with the Kuomintang nationalists, led by Sun Yat-sen. These instructions called for Chinese Communist Party members to join the KMT as individuals, while still retaining their association with the CCP. Zhou Enlai was one of these individuals. After joining the KMT, they would try to use it as a way to start the communist revolution. Within a few years, this strategy would become the source of major friction between the KMT and the CCP. Soon after birth, Zhou Enlai was adopted by his father's younger brother, Zhou Yigan, who was ill with tuberculosis. The adoption was arranged because the family feared Yigan would die without an heir. The young Zhou was raised by Yigan's widow, whose surname was Chen. Like Zhou, Madame Chen was from a scholarly family and received a traditional literary education. According to Zhou, he was close to his adoptive mother and picked up his lifelong interest in Chinese literature and opera from her. His father Zhou Yinan had a reputation for honesty, intelligence and concern for others, but was also considered weak, and lacking in discipline and determination. He drifted across China, working in various occupations, in cities like Beijing, Shandong, Anhui, Shenyang, Inner Mongolia and Sichuan. Zhou later remembered his father as often being away from home and generally unable to support his family. After the decision was made to abandon the Jiangxi Soviet in 1934, Zhou was put in charge of organizing and supervising the logistics of the communist withdrawal. Making his plans in absolute secrecy and waiting until the last moment to inform the senior leaders of the group's movements, his objective was to break through the nationalist encirclement with as few casualties as possible, and before Chiang Kai-shek's forces were able to overrun the communist bases. Following the establishment of the People's Republic of China on October 1, 1949, Zhou was appointed both Premier of the Government Administration Council and Minister of Foreign Affairs. Through the coordination of these two offices and his position as a member of the five-man Standing Committee of the Politburo, Zhou Enlai became the architect of the early People's Republic's foreign policy, presenting China as a new, but responsible member of the international community. Although Zhou escaped direct persecution during the Cultural Revolution, he was not able to save many of those closest to him from having their lives destroyed. Sun Wei-shi, his adopted daughter, died on October 15, 1968, after 7 months of torture and imprisonment, by the evil Maoist Red Guards. The same year, Jiang Qing also had Zhou's adopted son, Sun Yang, tortured and murdered by the Red Guards. Zhou attended Stalin's funeral in Moscow on March 7, 1953. Chairman Mao Zedong didn't travel to Moscow, potentially because no senior Soviet politician had traveled to Beijing, or because Stalin rejected a meeting with Mao in 1948. While in Moscow, Zhou was received with respect by the Soviets, standing with the USSR's new leadership, instead of with the other foreign dignitaries in attendance. After Zhou's death, Mao Zedong didn't issue a statement acknowledging his achievements or contributions, and sent no condolences to his widow, Deng Yingzhao, herself a senior party leader. Mao forbade his staff from wearing black mourning armbands. Whether or not he would have attended Zhou's funeral is in question, as Mao himself was in very poor health at the time, but he did send a wreath to the funeral. In 1944, Zhou Enlai wrote to General Joseph Stilwell, attempting to convince him that the Americans need to supply the communists, and of the communists' desire for a united Chinese government after the war. Stilwell's open disenchantment with the nationalist government and Chiang Kai-shek personally motivated President Franklin D. Roosevelt to remove him before Zhou's diplomacy could have an effect. Following the Shanghai Massacre and the failed Nanchang Uprising in 1927, Zhou had to leave China in disguise to attend the Chinese Communist Party's 6th National Party Congress, which was being held in Moscow in the summer of 1928. The Congress had to be held in Moscow, because China was too dangerous for major communist conferences. Still interested in academic programs, Zhou traveled to visit Edinburgh University in early 1921. Due to financial problems and language requirements, he didn't enroll and returned to France at the end of the month. There are no records of Zhou entering any academic program in France, but he did join a Chinese communist cell in spring 1921. Zhou's early diplomatic successes came as the result of successfully pursuing a warm relationship with India's Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru. Zhou also managed to persuade India to accept China's occupation of Tibet in 1950. India later acted as a neutral mediator between China and the United States during the negotiations to settle the Korean War. Zhou's birth mother, Wan, died in 1907, when he was 9, and his adoptive mother, Madame Chen, died the following year, in 1908. At the time, his father was working in Hubei province, so he and his two younger brothers returned to Hunan, and lived with his father's younger brother Zhou Yikui for the next 2 years. The Korean War was Zhou's last military assignment. In 1952, Peng Dehuai succeeded him in managing the Central Military Commission. In 1956, he formally relinquished his post in the Military Commission and focused on his work in the Standing Committee, the State Council and Foreign Affairs. In Shenyang, Zhou attended the Dongguan Model Academy. In addition to new subjects like English and science, he was also exposed to the writings of reformers and radicals such as Liang Qijiao, Kang Yue, Chen Tanhua, Zhao Rong, and Zhang Binglin. His grandfather, Zhou Banlong, and his granduncle, Zhou Junang, were the first members of the family to move to the city of Huyan. Panlong apparently passed the provincial examinations, and it was later claimed that he served as a magistrate governing Huai'an County. Zhou assumed a more prominent and active role in political activities as he grew up. The largest of these activities were rallies in support of a nationwide boycott of Japanese goods. As the boycott became more effective, the Chinese government tried to suppress it. Like most of his classmates at the time, Zhou went to Japan in July 1917 for further studies. During his 2 years in Japan, he spent most of his time in the East Asian Higher Preparatory School, a language school for Chinese students. On January 27, 1946, the CCP Secretariat appointed Zhou Enlai as one of 8 leaders to participate in a future coalition government. It was also suggested that he be nominated as China's vice president. By the time Zhou began attending Nankai Middle School in Tianjin, it had adopted the educational model used at the Phillips Academy in the United States. His classmates included Ma Jun and Casey Wu,